Former Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor Sir Robert Buckland is next to give evidence in the lockdown inquiry. Now, lockdown restrictions saw some of the most egregious assaults on our civil liberties, with ordinary citizens treated like criminals for simply enjoying some fresh air. Thousands of people lost their hard-earned money to fines of up to £10,000 for the shocking crimes of not wearing a face covering, sitting in a park, or meeting someone indoors. At least 3,000 of the COVID fines handed out to the public have resulted in lingering criminal records to this day. The ironic and cruel twist, of course, came when it was revealed that the government, who were making the impossible draconian rules, weren't even bothering to follow them themselves. So why was the law used to issue such harsh punishments at such a fraught time for the British public? Well, Sir Robert Buckland was at the heart of government and pandemic policy making when all of this was happening. And he joins me now with the inside track on why the law was imposed on civilians. So, Sir Robert Buckland, great to have you here. Obviously, you were Justice Secretary throughout this pandemic. You were at the heart of the decision making. Looking back, do you have any regrets?
No, I don't. I think it was essential that we viewed this in several stages. So the idea that the police should come in heavy-handed and, as you say, criminalise law-abiding members of the public is something I think none of us wanted to see. And in fact, the first approach that the police would take was not one of heavy-handedness. The guidance was very clear that they should talk to people and encourage. And in fact, in the vast majority of cases, that is precisely what happened. Now, I accept that I think that some of the prosecutions, the implementation of the law did go awry because there were cases that were successfully challenged and rightly appealed and overturned. But the overall principle of underpinning what were, I accept, a very draconian set of circumstances was, I think, correct. Don't forget that this was time limited. This was an exceptional course to take. And I don't think any of us took any pleasure in what was happening, but we felt it was, and genuinely and honestly felt that it was necessary in the interests of all of us in order to deal with what was still a very unknown property in terms of the virus, and doing everything we could to minimise the spread of what then was still a dangerous disease.
Were there any discussions taking place in Cabinet and involving you, saying, is this potentially going too far? Criminalising everyday acts, criminalising going around to see a relative? Because I ask you that question because you look at the case of the tragic young boy, Arthur Labinjo Hughes, and his family members were reluctant to actually go around to his parents' house. We know now that his parents murdered the young boy because they'd been threatened by police with lockdown laws. We obviously also know the horrendous case of Sarah Everard and the way that vile policeman, whose name I will not use tonight, also used the cloak of lockdown laws to get her into his car.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I mean, those are two appalling cases where the good faith and trust of people was abused. And I can't think of a more appalling set of circumstances in either case. But I think it's right to say that overall, we were anxious to try and strike a balance here between the need for this virus to be addressed and its spread to be as controlled as possible, and also that intrusion upon our civil liberties that I accept happened, but which was for a limited time period only. I think, looking back, I think it was in all our minds that this was a temporary set of measures that we would seek to overturn at the earliest possible opportunity when it was judged appropriate to do so. And of course, that is what happened. And I think, looking back, what I would say is that I think if we end up in a position like this again, we probably need a more robust legal framework overall in order to deal with emergencies like like a pandemic. You know, the law, Public Health Act was nearly 40 years old. We had other laws that just didn't work for this type of scenario. And I think, you know, the lesson to be learned here for governments in the future is to prepare a framework here, legal framework that can be debated carefully and properly with all the considerations that you and I care about in mind, so that we don't end up having to rush things through in a way that causes unforeseen circumstances.
I know you're very passionate about the issue of domestic abuse, which unquestionably increased as a result of the pandemic. Is that what, sorry, I would say as a result of the lockdown. I'm going to be very clear with my language there, because it was the lockdown itself actually that caused, I believe, the increase in domestic violence. What lessons have you learned from that specifically?
Well, I think the sad truth is that domestic abuse was with us long before the lockdown. I think the lockdown no doubt exacerbated it, because a victim of domestic abuse had nowhere to go. The fact that people were locked down meant that there was no source of help or comfort or shelter or sanctuary from the abuser. And we called it hidden harms. You know, in fact, I remember having, you know, meetings and round tables with all the victims groups that do so much to campaign for this. In Number 10, I remember having a meeting in there. And what we did was we ramped up the funding and the support that we were giving to all the phone lines and the groups that do so much to support victims, in order to make the message very clear that you are not alone. And we did see a surge in calls and complaints and concerns being raised by victims. But there's no doubt that, you know, this will have left a lasting legacy. I think anything that gets us to talk more openly about domestic abuse is good, but talk is one thing. It's the action now that we need to see continued as a result of the ramping up of the approach that I and others took to support all those groups that do such great work to support victims of domestic abuse.
I want to talk to you, Robert, about the tier system as well, that was introduced at the end of 2020. And I believe that in hindsight, you think that there were some issues with this tier system, which seemed to punish particular geographical areas, didn't it? If you look at places like Bolton and Manchester, they remained locked down for so much longer than other parts of the country.
That's right, Dan. I mean, I think there was a genuine attempt to try and avoid a national blanket approach to lockdown. You know, I think all of us agree that lockdown is a very blunt instrument. Let's face it. You know, it's indiscriminate. It involves millions of people. And there was a genuine attempt, and I think, you know, quite a well-evidenced and researched attempt to try and regionalise the approach to deal with different incidences in different parts of the country. Now, that was entirely understandable. I think what it led to, sadly, was perhaps a lack of clarity and sometimes, frankly, downright confusion. You know, if you were having to travel due to your essential work between different tiers, it all became extremely complicated, and, you know, very tough decisions were having to be made by workers and others who are having to do this, or people with family in different parts of the country. And I think that by the time we got to remember that November lockdown, when we went back into full lockdown, I think the position had become very complex indeed. And that's why I think the approach that we took in very late 2020, early 21, to have a plan, a winter plan, with key stages for us to come progressively out of lockdown, was offered a much clearer perspective, not just for families and individuals, but for business as well, in order for them to help plan what their futures were going to look like. And I think that met with a very a warmer support from the public. And of course, it was coupled then with the fast developing vaccination programme. So we moved out of that difficult period of tiers into a much more sustained approach, which I think yielded great results in 2021.
Fascinating insight. Thank you so much for giving evidence in our lockdown inquiry. That was the former Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, Sir Robert Buckland.